We would like to have general discussion, including participants. Panelists are invited to respond to the questions forwarded. First of all, I would like to read out several questions. And I am going to nominate the speaker who is going to respond to the given question. First of all, 2 questions. I would like to introduce you 2 questions. The first one, for session 1 speakers, including Dr. Hatano, Takeda, Payne. Let me read the question. During the war, Japan hoisted ideals and the discrepancies between the actual operations, especially in regard to China, has been some discrepancies, including Dr. Payne's geopolitical argument. What can be discussed and what can be learned from the ideal versus the actual operations and the other military actions? That's question 1. Question 2, for the second session speakers, including Professor Mayoro, Farrell, Asada, to those 3 speakers. This is a question. Asia-Pacific wars, perhaps after the flow or the situations of war period, we are going to see the war placed in a broad perspective in terms of geological coverage and the involvement depths. What are the indications in regard to global history addressing the big flow or trend or tendencies starting from the interwar period? And let me invite speakers. And we have another 55 minutes for this discussion part. Let me start. Professor Hatano, could you? Well, I and Dr. Takeda both mentioned or touched upon the Great East Asia Conference, Japanese ideals and principles, and actual policies and actions taken by Japan. People often ask us similar questions to this one. The integration and war philosophy and political philosophy and discrepancies. Well, the Greater East Asia Conference had 5 pillar principles, and these pillars do not directly mention the execution of war operations. It has some distance. And this was led by then Foreign Minister Shigemitsu. He dared to make some distance from these principles to the actual war operations. At that time, Japan was in the middle of war, which seems to be not winnable. That means the post-war vision, which would include Japan, would be part of the perspective for the conveners of the Great East Japan Conference. Like Dr. Takeda said, perhaps a philosophy which be launched by the Westerners such as UK and US, like independence, equality, and so on should be included in the conference philosophies or the declarations, so to leave some evidence that Japan was inclusive to those Western ideals and philosophies. I think they were aware of the potentials, so that Japanese philosophy evidence would be left behind when it comes back to the post-war visions building, so to speak, so that Japan's position in post-war era would be somewhat be secured, rather than not to do that. After leaving the post of foreign minister, Mr. Shigemitsu left the position in 1955 April, but he persuaded the emperor before the war end, and also before and after the Japan's defeat, he tried to replant or transplant some of the ideas Japan used to have, which was not very successful in the end. But why Shigemitsu supported and hoisted Western or U.S. Anglo philosophies? For one thing, the objective of the war, for example, to create or build a prosperity zone or sphere led by Japan, that was one situation or one status of the prosperity zone. But apart from that, the Wilsonian post-war vision that he envisioned for the post-war world, for example, open resources and equalities among races and so on, should be placed. And he wanted to deter the military forces in the country. But the end is nearing, and his maneuvers were not at all successful. But for one thing, he wanted to change the course of war, or at least the trend of war, which has been dominated by the military forces. And he had some intention to change the course. As Ietsuka said, war is a kind of revolutionary change to the society. Having that said, according to Shigemitsu, unconditional surrender, when it comes, should be accepted. That was his idea. And the other leaders wanted to avoid unconditional surrenders. That's why they wanted to place hope for the negotiation with the Soviets and so on. But in case of Shigemitsu, he was not a foreign minister at the time of surrender. But he was saying that we should accept unconditional surrender unilaterally, and we should dismantle the military forces completely. He had next generation philosophy for the country. That was his conviction. Dr. Takeda, please. Thank you for the question. As Professor Hatano said about this declaration of Greater East Asia, when I authored my thesis for graduation, I saw the publication by Dr. Hatano on the theme. I was inspired by his book. That was 20, 30 years ago. Dr. Hatano's answer needs no additional comment, but here's my thought. the philosophies or ideals of the Great East Asia was not one. It was not unified. There are multiple versions to it, I would say. The full text of the declaration and the preamble carried the self-respect and self-reliance. And although we were confronting the Western ideals, but the 5 principles or the pillars were quite similar to the counterpart to Charter. And discrepancies between the ideal and the reality has to be discussed in this context. And also, Shigemitsu was imprisoned at Sugamo for Tokyo Tribunal, and he left a diary, and I edited his diary from the originals, and some are unpublished. And as you can imagine, some are omitted officially, but when I took a look at them, what he wanted to accomplish before the war is accomplishable after the war, he wrote. And after he was released for probation, the probation committee interview was held, and he mentioned that he wanted to accomplish what he could not before the war. So he had a post-war vision, and he already envisioned the starting point or starting line. And he placed his hope in underline this.
If I understand the question correctly, it's about the relationship of ideals versus military operations and geopolitics, and what can we learn from all of this. When I think about it, one of the things that human beings like to do is to look at things only from their own perspective, and so they think it's my ideals, my operations, and then what am I supposed to, why are things not happening the way I thought they should? And this is a very American problem as well. And you need to look at the other side and ask, so for Japan, it's ideals. What's the term in English is the value of the object. What is the value of certain ideals to various Japanese people? How important are different ideals? But then you need to look around to the other side and go, okay, if we're going to do this in the Philippines or somewhere else, do they share these ideals? And if so, is it the same level of sharing? And another point is, if there is in these colonial places, there's tremendous disagreement. Isn't that the whole problem, that they don't have very strong institutions? There's all kinds of disagreement. And so there's going to be an interaction that Japan or the United States, whatever the country is going to do something, but then the local people are going to do things that you may not appreciate. And so that there is an interaction involved. So to me, a great lesson that we human beings in general have trouble learning is to take into account other people's interests and actions, because they most surely will protect their own interests. And when I try to describe this to, say, students at the U.S. Naval War College, where I've taught for many years, I've just retired, is I talk about half-court tennis. You know the game of tennis, right? And it's as if Americans have this problem where they only look at Team America, right? You've heard this, America first. And it's only going to look at the U.S. side of the net. And who knows what goes on the other side of the net, right? And then there are surprising things that happen when you ignore the other side. And yet Americans love their favorite game of American football, and they know about all the different teams, right? They know about all of the different players. And why they don't think foreign affairs requires that level of expertise, I have no idea. But it's a problem, and I think that will be probably one of the lessons back here, back in the time, for ideals Japan had back in the 30s that didn't work out remotely the way people wanted to, because you have to look at other people. Do they share your ideals? And in the Great Depression and in societies that don't have institutions, it's complicated. Thank you.
So for the second question, let me repeat the second question. So for Dr. Mayoro and Dr. Sada for the session, this is a question to professors in session 2. In Asian Pacific, there will be with the change and flows and also decolonization and in the large context of the decolonization and after the World War II, in looking at the 20th century World War, what kind of implication does the World War II have? And starting with Dr. Mayoro. Dr. Mayoro, please, for this second question.
I think this is on. First of all, I would just say that I'm a historian in a department mostly dominated by international relations theorists and social scientists, and much of that has probably rubbed onto me. So asking me to abstract even more is a dangerous thing. But I'll take a shot at it. And I think in my paper identified these three fundamental changes: population politics, the advent of high modernism as an intellectual and trans-ideological apparatus, and the advent of adversarial resource politics. And I think all of these, in a sense, certainly resource politics has been in the front pages for well over a year, and in fact in the daily news. It's really difficult, and this is always the problem of being a historian and trying to teach history, to convey just how much of a complete break and transformation something can be. And you know, the First World War itself, the outbreak is really just simply a Balkans crisis, a great power crisis that escalated onto a worldwide scale. The Second World War was really about those fundamental changes, understanding that managing populations, however defined, is central to international politics, that the leverage, that the idea that you could actually harness state power to completely remake everything was really just a completely different view. And what's interesting and what we forget about is it was liberals, small l, liberal conservative thinking, that also embraced that idea that you could actually engineer global peace through a League of Nations, that you could control the global economy with data, is a very small L liberal idea. Now, post-war, it becomes something else, because the war became defined around as a conflict between sort of democratic powers, liberalism, versus authoritarian totalitarianism. And what's really interesting in historiography is the recent writings about the history of liberalism as an idea or as an ideology. Whereas we've been used to writing about fascism or communism as a developing idea, there were very few histories of liberalism up until quite recently. But now you see many books, including, and I forgot the author's name, with the titles like Cold War Liberalism. And the fundamental point is that it's defined against this idea of a high modernist authoritarianism. But we seem to be swinging back to that, is the point that I wanted to make. And in each of these categories, we see transformations that have been permanently embedded, like the idea of the national homogeneity is the fundamental basis for sovereignty. And I wonder, before I mentioned it, how many in this audience actually remembered or had any inkling about the Lausanne Conference and the population transfer. This is completely forgotten. But it becomes a head spinner when you think about this idea of, transferring the population out of Gaza to somewhere else. I mean, we're almost, again, a head spin. We're seem to be back to the idea of moving populations around. Of course, it was a post-war phenomena. We forget also that the Second World War in Europe is based on 12 to 14 million people defined as German being pushed across frontiers. Because after the experiences of the 1930s and 40s, again, the pursuit of kind of national homogeneous populations defined the peace settlement. And again, I think I partly can only repeat myself in saying that certainly since the 1990s, the idea that you somehow had to control your supply chains or dominate the own sources of particular minerals or fuels would have been alien, right? Because so long as global markets are functioning and we have a global a system of moving and supply chains, well, why do you need to control it? And now we seem to be back to something that I think is actually, again, fundamentally dangerous because it is kind of war by economic means. Now, whether that has to escalate or not, I was optimistic, and I think I still wish to be. Thank you.
Well, secure in a history department, I'll be concrete and empirical. Okay. In the years between the wars, nationalism, the desire for decolonization, political independence, it was present in Southeast Asia. It wasn't very strong. The movements were not very big. People like Sukarno and Ho Chi Minh, they scurried around in the shadows, got themselves arrested. The war had a huge impact on that. All of a sudden in 1945, they became leaders bidding for independence. But I want to turn our direction for a moment to another aspect, another ramification of the war with Japan, and that is India. In the interwar years, Indian independence movements were much stronger. Gandhi's campaigns in the 1920s had made him a world-famous figure. But a huge split had developed in the Congress. There were, on the one hand, leaders like Gandhi and Nehru who wanted to continue to negotiate independence and British departure politically, non-violently. There were, on the other hand, the less patient leaders such as Subhas Chandra Bose, who wanted to use force and throw them out. Bose fled to Germany in 1939. The British Secret Service and police probably turned a blind eye and let him go. But the war with Japan had a very interesting impact on all of this. Not only did it create a rift between the Muslims and the Hindus as to what the future of a post-war India should be, but it provided an opportunity for Congress to get its act together. A large number of Indian soldiers who were taken prisoner in Singapore were enticed by Japanese military intelligence into a splinter group called the Indian National Army. They were eventually organized into a division about 20,000 strong, and in due course, Bose, who fled Europe and came back to Asia, took command and became the leader of the Free India movement and the commander of the division. And in 1944, in the campaign that led to the attack on Imphal and Kohima, they were thrown into battle. They were not well trained or equipped. They were not well used. Good things did not happen to them. Many of them were captured. But here's where the story gets interesting. The post-war British government of Clement Attlee is interested in negotiating Indian independence right away. But like every other British government, they hope to bring about an arrangement whereby a friendly post-independent India will remain a firm British ally lining up inside the British Commonwealth. That's their objective. Right? This gets compromised along the way. And one of the reasons, there are a number, but one of the reasons was the Indian National Army. Very unwisely, the British authorities decided to put a number of senior officers who had fought in the Indian National Army on trial for treason. Nehru, Cambridge-educated lawyer that he was, saw his opportunity. The army and the country were deeply divided about the INA. Some had rejected them for turning their back on their families. Others had said that they were operating on a choice. Nehru saw an opportunity to hand an olive branch over to the other side of Congress and to those in the army who didn't want the INA punished. He took on the defense of the ringleaders personally. He became their trial lawyer. The trial was staged for the Red Fort in Delhi, the old home of the Mughal emperors. The insult to Indian nationalism couldn't have been greater on the part of the British. And Nehru argued that whatever we may feel about what these men did, who are they being traitors to? Because we are all trying to do the same thing, win independence and freedom for India. He made such a mockery out of the prosecution case that on the advice of the commander-in-chief of the army, General Auchinleck, the authorities adjourned it. No verdict, but damage was done. Too late. The rift in Congress was healed, momentum shifted to Nehru, and they never looked back. Direct repercussion of the war. Accelerated independence for India.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you.
Dr. Asada, please. Thank you. In the 20th century Asia-Pacific War, what can we say in the Asia-Pacific? What can we say for that?
First, as Dr. Farrell said, before the Second World War, Southeast Asia and East Asia, they saw the British as a hegemon, but it was replaced by the United States after the end of the war. But in the name of the liberation, Soviet Union expanded its the influence, as Dr. Payne elaborately discussed in her presentation today. And so then the Japan and these countries became on the forefront as a result. Over the last 80 years, it was not realized by the Japanese, but in other countries in Asia, over the last 80 years, many of them experienced some the armed conflict or the very heightened tensions. So I think, in a way, Asia-Pacific area invited the tensions of the Cold War. Thank you very much. Three speakers answered the question, but I'd like to invite other speakers, other panelists now. And I also invite ask all the speakers to make any additional comments, if any. Dr. Farrell, do you have any additional comments?
I'm fine for now, thanks. Yeah.
Dr. Mayoro, do you have any additional comments to make? Or? Any other speakers? Thank you very much. And then I'd like to move on to another question addressed to Dr. Payne and Dr. Hatano. Complexity of the war. Well, complex war or multiple war or nested war, such terminology is used. From these perspectives, how should we understand the relationship between wars, as multiple of wars are complexly related with each other? How can we understand this? Dr. Hatano, perhaps first, would you please respond? Well, the Pacific War and the Greater East Asia War, for me, they are not a single war. Instead, all of these theaters were separate, and they had different perspectives of nature. I would say that the Allied powers maintained barely their unity throughout, but amongst the Allied powers, there were many gaps as to how Japan could be ruled after the war, or how Asia should look like after the war. But unity was maintained until the end of the war. But when it comes to Japan, well, Japan fought many adversaries, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and China. Japan fought these wars, 4 wars. Well, at the end, they converged with each other in a way, perhaps due to the war with the Soviet Union, I would say. Well, as a way of, I think this way, because as I said previously, for one, the view on the war in Japan, was it a war for survival? Was it a war for liberation? I think the discussion in Japan tends to leads to this very simple dichotomy. But by separating the war into 4 wars, as I said, I think we can understand much better, much deeply the entire war, the fought in this at the time, and by analyzing the war, by separating into these two forces, well, I think the one lesson is that we must not increase the number of enemies. Well, the war with Britain, they expanded into the war with the China and with the United States, and then even with the Soviet Union. So Japan's problem was Japan ended up increasing the number of its enemy. Well, of course, for various reasons, but China, war with China started, and then Japan increased the number of its enemy. So I think this is a very serious problem yet to be more seriously analyzed. And so what's the relationship among these four wars? Well, for the Japanese army, for the Imperial Army and the Navy, they tried to find some strategic relevance amongst connecting these wars, but the Army and Navy were at odds, and also they had there was the different views toward the different enemies, and so in Japan in general, I think the Japanese didn't fail to have a comprehensive the picture of all these four wars. I think the China-Japan war was the longest, but still the war was isolated from the entire entire Pacific theater. So how should we understand the relationship between the China-Japan war and also other wars that Japan fought? And what does it mean for us if we end the war with Japan? Japanese didn't find the answers to these questions, so that's why the war with China dragged on and on. As Dr. Takeda said, the one way to solve the war with China was to come up with a so-called new China policy. And with that, the Japanese tried to solve the end the war with China without relying on the help from Germany. I think Japan could have been able to solve the problem without the support from Germany. But how to do that? That was not decided by the Japanese. With the new China policy, well, if the military operation was in stalemate, then Japan might be able to solve the problem concerning the war with China with this new China policy. But the war intensified, so the resources were taken. So Japan couldn't solve independently the war with China. Toward the end of the war, well, even though Japan talked about solving the problem of Japan-China war, well, solving that, but what does it mean? Well, many started talking about that Japan should first solve or settle the war with China. So that means that Japan tried to understand the problem, the China war, separately from the wars. Thank you very much, Dr. Payne.
If I understand about all these different types of wars, I'm going to give you frameworks from how it's taught at the U.S. Naval War College and the Strategy Department, and I hope these concepts will be useful to you. If not, I hope I don't waste too much of your time. One of the ways is to divide wars by type, civil wars, right? And within a country, be regime change, someone's going to be in power and someone's not. Regional wars between 2 or 3 countries, maybe it's alliances, maybe it's not, over something going on in a region. And then there are global wars, and those are about the nature of the international system, how we shall all interact with each other, what it's going to be before the war versus after the war. So that's one way of looking at it, but now I'm going to add some other things. In the United States, we often assign for these sorts of topics Karl von Clausewitz's famous book on war. And the way, in the English reading, Anglophone world, there are different ways of reading that book, but in the Anglophone world is looking at his limited versus unlimited objectives. An unlimited objective between 2 countries means that the country that loses, its government is not going to be standing at the end of the day. It's going to be a different government. And if it's a really even more unlimited objective, like the sort of objective Hitler had, they're going to annihilate an entire civilian population as well. But it's like a spectrum. That's way off on the unlimited side. On the limited side, it might be a small piece of territory that changes. It might be, who knows, a trading regime. But it's a whole spectrum, right? It goes from really small things to really big things. And the idea is that another piece is you've got to look at each belligerent in the war. So let's take Japan in World War II Pacific. Japan has a limited objective vis-a-vis the United States. It is not for regime change in Washington, although that might be nice, but that's not the goal, right? It's America out of Asia, something like that. Whereas when the United States gets involved in that thing, from the United States point of view, it's an unlimited objective vis-a-vis Japan. Or you can look at the Ukraine war today. Ukrainian's not about regime change in Moscow. Moscow definitely about regime change in Ukraine and possibly killing the Ukrainian, well, definitely the Ukrainian culture and maybe a lot of Ukrainian people. Okay, so those are other things. So people like to talk about total wars and things, but it's useful to look at the limited versus unlimited objective, because if you have an unlimited objective, the person that you have that for, it's existential stakes. So when Japan goes into China, originally in Manchuria, it's a limited objective, right? It's to take Manchuria or set up Manchukuo, whatever it is, but it's not regime change in China yet. Later on, it becomes regime change in China. The problem with an unlimited objective, if someone's coming at you with that, the chances are you're really going to resist. And then if you also want to commit genocide, which is not what Japan's doing in China, I do not believe, but it is probably what Russia wants to do in Ukraine. You can expect people to fight. You talk about, it's what Hitler did to the Russians. He comes in and wants to kill all the Slavs and change Stalin's regime. Well, you take basically a failing state. Stalin has just shot his general staff and who knows the rest of his military. They've gone through this crazy collectivization and starvation, and doing that to them transforms them from a failing state to a lethal enemy. And you can see this transformation taking place with Ukraine right now, where the Ukrainians are reforming their government institutions, and they may well have the finest army in Europe, and this is all ongoing. And so that's another thing to look at. And the other thing, as you're looking at all these wars, you should look at who is a primary enemy, who's a secondary enemy, tertiary enemy. So there's been discussion about how the Allied alliance worked better than the Axis alliance. Well, the Allies all had the same primary enemy. It's called Germany, right? Get rid of Germany, and then Japan is problem number 2. But Germany's problem number 1, definitely for Russians, definitely for Britons, and the United States also agreed on Germany's number 1. If you look at the Axis, primary enemy for Italy is Britain. That's what's getting in the way of the Third Roman Empire, wherever it's going to be. And for Japan, it's probably China, right? Because China is what Japan wants at the end of the day, is whatever the settlement is going to be there. And then, of course, For the Germans, it's all about Russia. So they're focusing on 3 different theaters, and this is what makes it, it's not only that they're geographically dispersed, but they have different primary enemies. So when you're going to examine something about, which I know nothing, but here's a try. If you're looking at the Middle East, really complicated. Look at all the different parties involved, neutrals, belligerents. Who are their primary enemies, right? And then take ethnic groups, like say within Iraq, you've got Kurds, you've got Shia, you've got Sunnis. Who are their primary enemies? Is it someone within the country itself? Or is it a neighbor? And you look at all of this and you try to stack it up and nothing really aligns. And then, no kidding, the war goes on forever, right? So anyway, those are, I think, the basic concepts, but limited and unlimited objectives are really key. Oh, and another one is the value of the object. Of whatever win is, how valuable is it to each side? So if we look at the Russo-Japanese War, victory in that war is much more important to Japan because it's happening in Japan's neighborhood, immediate security, than it is for Russia. And so when you have this asymmetry in the value of the object, you have much better odds of, if the winning side that values it more, much better odds of having that war end. So that's another one to look at. So I probably missed something, but those are some of the concepts I think that help disaggregate these wars and figure out what's what. Thank you.
Thank you very much. About this question, this was addressed to Dr. Hatano and Dr. Bain. And what about Dr. Shoji? Would you like to give some comments on this? Well, the complexity, multiplicity of the war has been mentioned by Dr. Hatano already, and individual wars are completely different from each other. But all the way through Japan, like Dr. Payne said, Japan had no strategy for the Pan-Pacific, so to speak. Before the war broke out, Japan had some operational plan, and there was an annex to it. And Germany, the assumption is going to win. And along with that, Japan would be on the Germany's side, and then we would win. And they didn't mention how they are going to strategically fight. And basic plan for the all operations do not have strategies written, so to speak. Therefore, each front or each theater had non-integrated strategies, but it started to converge eventually towards the end, and Japan started to see America or U.S. as a common enemy in all theaters, so to speak, and to retain emperor system for the country. And then the defeat against U.S. resulted in the defeat of the war, and the war ended. And the assumption was Germany's victory was at the beginning. But you see, the war situations broke out in Europe, and that inspired or discouraged Japan for the aggression into other areas or withdrawals from the other and so on. So Japan was well influenced by the situations in Europe, especially the win or lose situation of the Germany. Thank you very much. Time-wise, this is going to be the last question for the group. Based upon your presentations today, or listening to the others' presentations, Pacific War as a global history. In this context, how does it apply or relate to the contemporary global situations, especially for Asia or Indo-Pacific? Any meaningful impact or implications from the past? This is a question to all of you. And could you summarize your comment in a minute or two? And I would like to invite your last moment message to the audience before you leave the podium. Please, Dr. Hatano. Dr. Hanada. Thank you for the question. As for me, I was invited as a commentator. And I would like to go over this once again. At the beginning, like I said, the 3 documents for the Japan's security policies has been shaken with the current situation. So this particular war history has contemporary meetings. This type of social science is not subject to experiment. You cannot test things. We have to always keep learning lessons from the past, and that is a necessary attitude. That's all. Thank you, Dr. Asada. Thank you for the question. Asia Pacific basically has been focusing on the US-Japan war at large, and then added the Japan-China element, and then we began to have a enlarged perspective. Now it's called finally global history. And Sarah Payne's book really teach you more about it. This was my little advertisement on her book. Thank you.
Thank you. I read Shiba Ryutaro's 4-volume classic. In English, it's called Cloud Above the Hills. I absorbed his argument that a whole generation of Japanese military and political leaders, that their formative experience was the Russo-Japanese War, not the First World War, that they went into the 1930s thinking that even great power war could be controlled, contained, limited. Of course, they turned out to be very wrong, but the big question is the Second World War an outlier, or is it now the way great powers wage war? We've only had one possible close call since then, which is 1950 to 53, but I would argue that China was really by courtesy a great power at the time. Near miss, though. We had Chinese troops fighting U.S. troops. We haven't had head-to-head great powers since then. The big question, of course, has to be, have we now advanced into an era where whenever great powers fight, it's not going to be controllable, and it couldn't be contained or limited. That's something I think to think long and hard about.
Thank you for the question. I won't elaborate on what I gave at the end of my talk in terms of contemporary relevance to reflecting on the global Second World War. What I will do is kind of address the other question slightly, in which I would just, as a historian of war studies department, one of the, we're constantly having debates about, when do wars start? What is the war? And I think the conclusion I've reached is that part of the history of war is actually that debate about what is the war. Is it 4 wars? Is it 1 war? Is it a hybrid war? I mean, just think about the number of terms we invent for something short of war, or we talk about war economy, or, in the 1920s and 30s, there were all kinds of metaphors that were imported into economics about war, but of course they didn't mean war, except they were at war in many respects by harnessing economic weapons. So I think in terms of, I just would signal a caution about thinking about war and coming to any kind of definite conclusion, this is the war. The war is defined via those who wage it. Because I think when we think about, I mean, what's the point of being a historian if you can't look back and sort of say, well, maybe they understood a lot of fragments, but they really didn't actually appreciate the immensity of the whole. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Dr. Hatano? Well, that's in one word. We shouldn't increase the numbers of enemies. You want to make as many friendly nations as many as possible. It's very important. I mean, until the end of the Pacific War has ended, our enemies, numbers of our enemies have increased until 1945. So you need to keep and be in good friends with the friendly countries is very important. And that is the reflection and lessons learned from the Pacific War. I'm sure there'll be others, but I don't have time. Maybe you can mention later if we have time. So, Dr. Takeda? Well, in the Second World War II, how do we interpret and perceive the World War II? I would say in the fighting in terms of the quantities, and this is an old topic, but that is in a modern sense. And that is some significant meaning, I think. Well, in the same time, in the Europe, what is the similar or is it different from Europe into Japan? And also in Japan, there's many different theories in Japan as well. And maybe the change of the context, and maybe that is also changing as well, still today. And that could be the good hint for the future as well. That is what we are providing, I think. Thank you. And Dr. Payne?
Like the period for the Second World War, the nature of the global order is again at stake, and what it is going to be, and the continentalists are on the march, continentalists being China and Russia definitely. And if they have their way, the world will be divided into mutually exclusive spheres of influence with rules within each sphere, and disputes will be settled by coercion and war. And that is a negative-sum world order. What do I mean by that? If you're fighting, you're destroying wealth. We've just done a whole presentation on World War II. If you look at it, the amount of wealth that was destroyed is just unbelievable. And the miracle of most of our times has been the inter-Cold War period, when the great powers stopped trying to fund opposing insurgencies, and tremendous increase of wealth throughout the world. A miracle of our times, but that apparently is over. And there are also ruminations in the United States about turning towards a continentalist approach in foreign policy. And if that actually takes place, it'll be a disaster, because there's only one win-win way to deal with each other, and it's to go to these international institutions, deploy the lawyers and the diplomats, and sort out whatever it is. You may not like it. It'll be a far more efficient way of sorting things out than running it through sending your soldiers. But World War II is a great example of what we as human beings should never allow to happen again. But we have as in the last World War, we have a group of profoundly reckless leaders in very important places, in many places, and that is precisely the scary part. So this will all be very consequential. And if everyone does what they can, nothing will happen, and then I'll just be the crazy person who had all these worries that never came to pass, and I hope that'll be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shoji, advisor. Well, in the morning, I have asked a question to Dr. Payne in the morning, and the intention, the questions, there's been the war between U.S. and Japan, And we tend to think that there may have been those conflict between U.S. and Japan. But from the global perspective, but just like the Great Asia Declarations, but there are conflicts and relationship to the other countries affected our relations. So if we look at the global history, it is not only the conflict between the two nations, between U.S. and Japan, but rather there are other type of relations with other countries that are. And for the 15 years in that time frame, that was the most exceptional time period in that 15 years, because that is the exceptional 15 years, but then it came back to establish a good friend relationship with the U.S. after the World War II. So that is what is happened in the World War. Thank you. So slide 3, we still have some time. I'd like to ask Mr. Hatano if there's anything that you'd like to say. Please, I'd like to ask Mr. Hatano to say something just because we have just a few minutes left. Well, because you wanted to say something. Well, I have a cold, so I'm wearing the mask, but I mentioned that we shouldn't make more enemies, but rather to make more friendly nations. And in the global history context, in that flow, and what is important is not just by your own country, like Japan, the more preferable Asian, and also in good terms with the neighboring countries, because you cannot just establish the order by one country, just by Japan. It shouldn't be, the world order should not be built by just one country, no. But rather, we need to cooperate with other nations and neighboring countries. As Choi-san has already mentioned, the value that we can share. We should share the value that we can, and with those countries in the collaboration or with the cooperation, we should, the Asian Pacific, the order should be established by cooperating each other. And so it should not be just established by one country. And that is the very critical in my thoughts. That's all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Are there any last minute, just one word, anybody wants to say at the very end of this? Dr. Marlon? Is there anything you'd like to say at the end? No? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to appreciate the panelists for the very active discussion, and also I'd like to appreciate the questions from the audience as well, and the viewers of this program.